His last words were, "I am an innocent man convicted of a crime I did not commit. I have been persecuted for 12 years for something I did not do." He said this on February 17, 2004, in the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 36 years old. He had been on death row since 1992. He had maintained his innocence from the first day of his arrest to the last minute of his life. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 in the evening. 4 days earlier, a fire scientist named Gerald Hurst had delivered a written report to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and to the governor's office. The report concluded that the fire investigation used to convict Willingham contained no valid scientific basis for concluding arson. Every key indicator the original investigators had cited — pour patterns, crazed glass, low burn patterns, char depth — had been either misidentified or relied on methodology that the fire science community had abandoned or substantially revised years before the trial. The Hurst report reached the governor's office on February 13, 2004. It was stamped "Received." It was not read before the execution was carried out. Willingham's lawyers had requested a stay of execution on the basis of the report. The request was denied. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted against recommending clemency. The governor declined to intervene. This is not the beginning of the story, it is the end of the mechanism. To understand how it got there, you have to start with the question of what kind of evidence sends a person to death row, and what kind of process is supposed to catch it when that evidence is wrong. Because the Willingham case is not a story about a single catastrophic failure at a single point in a single institution. It is a story about a chain, about what happens when multiple systems, each functioning within its own defined limits, each operating by its own rules, each producing an outcome that no individual within that system is required to prevent, all line up in a sequence that leads to an outcome that none of them, individually, could have produced alone. That chain starts 4 days before Christmas, 1991, in a small town in central Texas. Corsicana was a city of about 22,000 people, located 60 miles southeast of Dallas. It had a modest industrial economy, a high poverty rate by Texas standards, and a fire department that doubled as the city's primary fire investigation authority. On December 23, 1991, at approximately 5 in the morning, a fire broke out at a single-story wood frame house at 1202 West 11th Street. Inside the house were Cameron Todd Willingham, 23 years old, and his 3 daughters, Amber, who was 2 years old, and the twins Carmen and Cameron, who were 1. His wife, Stacy, was not home. She had gone out the night before and did not return until after the fire. Willingham got out of the house. His daughters did not. He was found outside by neighbors, barefoot, in a t-shirt, in December. He was hysterical. A neighbor later testified that she had tried to get back toward the house with him, and that he had been prevented from re-entering by the fire's intensity. He had burns on his hands. He told investigators he had tried to reach the children through the front door and through a window. He said the smoke was immediate and total. The Corsicana Fire Department arrived at approximately 5:12 in the morning. The structure was already heavily involved. The girls were found in the bedroom they shared. They had died of smoke inhalation before the fire reached them directly. The fire investigation began that same morning, once the structure was safe to enter. The lead investigator was a man named Manuel Vasquez, a deputy fire marshal for the state of Texas with nearly 20 years of experience. He was joined by Douglas Fogg, the assistant fire chief of the Corsicana Fire Department. They spent the day at the scene, photographing and documenting burn patterns, char depth, glass fracture patterns, and the path of the fire through the structure. Fire investigation is, at its core, a discipline of reading physical evidence. A trained investigator walks a burned structure and interprets what the fire left behind, where it burned hottest, where it traveled, where it started, and, critically, whether it started by accident or design. The methodology available to investigators in 1991 had been developed over decades of practitioner experience, codified in training manuals and professional certification programs, and transmitted through apprenticeship and coursework. It was not, for the most part, based on controlled scientific experimentation. It was based on the accumulated observations of people who had investigated many fires and had developed pattern recognition frameworks for distinguishing accidental fires from set ones. By the end of that first day, Vasquez and Fogg's preliminary conclusion was arson. It is important to understand what that conclusion was based on, because it is the foundation of everything that followed. Fire investigation in the early 1990s operated on a set of principles and indicators that had been established and, in many cases, never formally tested over decades of practitioner experience. These were not empirically validated standards. They were rules of thumb passed from experienced investigators to trainees, accumulated in practitioner manuals, and treated in the field as reliable diagnostic tools. Several of these indicators were central to Vasquez and Fogg's conclusion. The first was pour patterns, irregular low-burn areas on the floor that investigators interpreted as the residue of accelerant that had been poured in a specific path. The reasoning was intuitive and appeared on the surface logical. If a flammable liquid had been poured on a floor and ignited, the areas where the liquid had pooled would burn hotter and longer, leaving a distinctive char pattern. Vasquez identified what he described as pour patterns in multiple rooms of the Willingham house. To a trained investigator using the methodology of that era, the presence of pour patterns indicated that a flammable liquid had been deliberately spread across the floor before ignition. The second was crazed glass, a specific fracture pattern in window glass characterized by small, irregular curved cracks, resembling a cracked spider's web. Investigators of that era had been taught that crazed glass was a signature of rapid, intense heat, consistent with an accelerant fire. The theory was that a fire burning with the sudden, explosive intensity that accelerants produce would fracture glass in this distinctive way. Vasquez found crazed glass at the scene. The third was the general burn pattern, the spread and direction of the fire's path through the structure. Vasquez concluded that the fire had multiple points of origin, which in standard investigative methodology of the period indicated deliberate ignition at multiple locations, rather than accidental spread from a single source. The alternative, that a single accidental fire had spread rapidly through the structure and produced what looked like multiple origins, was not seriously examined in the documentation. There was also what Vasquez described as a burn trail, char evidence along a path that he interpreted as consistent with someone moving through the house with an accelerant, applying it as they walked from room to room. On the basis of these observations and related findings, Vasquez concluded that the fire had been intentionally set using a flammable liquid accelerant, most likely a petroleum product, spread across multiple rooms. 16 days after the fire, Willingham was charged with 3 counts of capital murder, 1 for each of his daughters. There was one aspect of the scene that investigators noted but did not ultimately weight heavily in their arson determination: the path of the fire itself. The children's bedroom was at the back of the house. Willingham was found at the front. The fire, by most accounts, travelled from somewhere in the front portion of the structure toward the back. A non-arson investigator, reviewing the documentation years later, would note that this pattern was consistent with an accidental fire originating in the front, possibly from a space heater or faulty electrical equipment, that spread through the wood frame structure with sufficient speed to trap the children before Willingham could reach them. That reading of the evidence was not the reading that was documented in Vasquez's report. Vasquez's report was what the prosecution had. The trial began in August of 1992 and lasted 8 days. The prosecution's case rested on 2 pillars. The first was the fire science. The second was character. Vasquez testified as the prosecution's primary expert on the fire's origin and cause. He presented the pour patterns, the crazed glass, the multiple origin theory, and the conclusion that the fire had been set intentionally. He used the language of established forensic practice. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had investigated fires for 20 years. He told the jury that in his professional opinion, the fire was unquestionably arson. He also testified about one other thing. During his examination of the scene, Vasquez had observed the contents of the house, the decorations on the wall, some of the personal items Willingham kept. He mentioned what he saw there. He told the jury that some of what he observed made him form an opinion about Willingham's character and what kind of person he was dealing with. This was not fire science. The jury heard it from the state's fire science expert. There was also the jailhouse informant. Johnny Webb testified that Willingham had confessed to him while they were housed together in the Navarro County Jail awaiting trial. Webb said Willingham had told him he set the fire and that he had done it deliberately to kill his daughters. Webb had a prior criminal record. He had charges pending at the time of his testimony. The relationship between his cooperation and the resolution of those charges was not fully explored in the record. And the prosecution presented the testimony of a forensic psychologist who described Willingham as a sociopath whose future dangerousness to society was near certain. This assessment was based on a review of records and a clinical interview. This was the prosecution's full case: arson science, a jailhouse informant, a sociopathy diagnosis. This is the point in the chain where the defense had its moment to intervene. It did not. Willingham was represented by a public defender. The attorney did not retain an independent fire science expert to review Vasquez's methodology. He did not challenge the scientific basis of the pour pattern interpretation. He did not introduce testimony from any expert who might have questioned whether crazed glass was a reliable arson indicator. The scientific premises underlying the entire prosecution case went to the jury as established, expert-validated fact. They were not established fact. By 1992, peer-reviewed research in fire science had already raised serious questions about multiple indicators Vasquez relied on. Studies published in the 1980s had shown that crazed glass could be produced by rapid water cooling, a standard firefighting operation, and had no reliable diagnostic value for distinguishing accelerant fires from non-accelerant fires. Research on floor burn patterns had demonstrated that low burn areas could result from flashover dynamics, from the natural accumulation of burning debris, and from the collapse of burning materials onto the floor, none of which required the presence of a poured accelerant. The fire science community had not uniformly adopted these findings by 1992, but the research existed. It was findable. An expert retained specifically to examine the prosecution's methodology could have found it, could have challenged the foundation of Vasquez's conclusions, and could have presented an alternative reading of the physical evidence to the jury. No such expert was retained. The reason given, in later accounts, was funding. Texas's indigent capital defense system in 1992 did not provide standardized, adequate resources for independent expert review of forensic evidence. The attorney had a budget. He made allocation decisions. Fire science expert review was not where the money went. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of capital murder. During the penalty phase, the psychologist's sociopathy assessment was presented again. The jury sentenced Willingham to death. He was 24 years old. His daughters had been 2 and 1. Willingham spent the next 12 years on death row in the Polunsky unit, approximately 100 miles north of Houston. He pursued his appeals through the Texas court system, through the federal courts, and through every administrative channel available to a condemned prisoner. He maintained in every filing, in every letter, and in every conversation with the lawyers and journalists who eventually came to his case that he had not set the fire. Death row in Texas is largely solitary confinement. Prisoners are housed in individual cells for 22 to 23 hours a day. Contact with other prisoners is limited. Visits are permitted but constrained. Communication with the outside world goes through letters, through occasional phone calls, through the attorneys working the case. Willingham wrote extensively to his family, to his ex-wife Stacy, to journalists who had taken an interest in the case. He maintained, in all of it, the same position he had stated from the first day of his arrest. The appeals process is not designed to re-examine the factual basis of a conviction. It is designed to identify constitutional violations, procedural errors, due process failures, ineffective assistance of counsel claims, prosecutorial misconduct. Factual innocence is not, in most American jurisdictions, a freestanding basis for post-conviction relief. A prisoner can be factually innocent and constitutionally convicted. The two things are legally separate. A court reviewing a capital conviction on habeas corpus is not asking whether the defendant did it. It is asking whether the process that produced the conviction was constitutionally valid. Willingham's appeals raised procedural grounds. Most were denied at the trial court level. His federal habeas petitions were denied. His requests for DNA testing on certain physical evidence were denied on the basis that the available evidence was not of the type that would yield genetic material. Each denial was documented. Each denial was appealed. Each appeal was denied. This is the machine working as designed. The machine was designed to correct procedural errors. The error in the Willingham case was scientific. A fire science methodology that was not scientifically valid had produced an arson determination. That arson determination was the entire factual basis for the conviction. The machine had no mechanism for examining that kind of error. It could check whether the jury instructions were correct. It could examine whether the prosecutor had withheld evidence. It could review whether the defense had been constitutionally adequate by the legal standard of adequacy, which is a very low standard. It could not, in any of its standard operating modes, commission a scientific review of whether the fire investigation methodology met current standards. In the year 2000, a Texas death penalty attorney named Walter Reeves took on Willingham's case. Reeves was experienced with capital litigation. He understood the system's limitations. He began looking for avenues outside the standard appellate track. In late 2003, with an execution date set for February 17, 2004, Reeves contacted the Innocence Project in New York. The Innocence Project's standard work involved DNA evidence, but its network included fire science experts who had been working on the problem of invalid arson indicators for years. One of those experts was Gerald Hurst, a Cambridge-educated chemist with a background in explosives research and a growing reputation for identifying flawed arson convictions across multiple states. Hurst reviewed the trial record, the fire investigation reports, the physical evidence documentation, and the photographs from the Willingham case. He was not paid for this review. He treated it as a professional obligation. He had done similar reviews in other cases and had found that the same invalid indicators kept appearing in investigations conducted by the same general community of practitioners trained on the same pre-scientific methodology. He prepared a written report. His conclusions were unambiguous. Every significant indicator Vasquez had cited as evidence of arson was either scientifically invalid or had a plausible accidental explanation. The pour patterns were consistent with flashover burn behavior in an ordinary residential fire with no accelerant present. Hurst explained the specific flashover mechanism, a phenomenon in which a room fire reaches a temperature at which all flammable surfaces in the room ignite simultaneously, producing fire behavior and burn patterns that can superficially resemble the effects of poured accelerant, and that an investigator relying on visual pattern recognition without understanding fire dynamics could easily misclassify. The crazed glass was consistent with rapid water application by firefighters, the thermal shock of cold water on hot glass, not the signature of an accelerant fire. The multiple origin theory was not supported by the physical evidence as documented. Hurst found no reliable scientific basis for concluding that the fire had been set intentionally. The report was submitted to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and to the Office of the Governor, Rick Perry, on February 13, 2004. 4 days before the execution. The execution date had been set months earlier. The legal process for requesting a stay based on newly submitted evidence had a specific structure and timeline. Willingham's attorneys filed the stay request. It moved through the system. The Board of Pardons and Paroles received the Hurst report and voted 11-0 against recommending clemency. Governor Perry received the report and declined to grant a stay. On the question of whether the report was substantively reviewed before these decisions were made, the public record is disputed. What is not disputed is the timeline. The report arrived on the 13th, the execution was on the 17th, and the decisions denying relief were made in the intervening days. A spokesperson for the governor's office later indicated that the governor's legal counsel had reviewed it. No documentation of that review, its conclusions, or its influence on the decision has been made public. On February 17th, Willingham was brought to the execution chamber. He made his final statement. He was given the lethal injection at 6:14 in the evening. He was pronounced dead at 6:18. The fire science did not stop being examined because he was dead. In 2005, the Texas legislature created the Texas Forensic Science Commission, an oversight body charged with investigating allegations of scientific negligence or misconduct in forensic evidence used in Texas criminal cases. The commission was not created because of Willingham. It was created as part of a broader push for forensic accountability. The Willingham case became one of its first high-profile dockets. In 2007, a complaint was filed with the commission specifically regarding the fire investigation methods used in the Willingham case. The commission opened a formal review and retained an independent expert, Dr. Craig Baylor, a fire scientist and the technical director of a major engineering research institute with an international reputation in fire science and fire investigation methodology. Baylor was not a hired advocate for any party. He was an independent scientific reviewer. His brief was to examine the documentation of the fire investigation and evaluate whether it met the standards of the field. Baylor conducted a comprehensive review of the Willingham fire investigation documentation. He reviewed Vasquez's reports, the trial testimony, the physical evidence records, the photographs, and the relevant fire science literature. In August of 2009, Baylor submitted his report to the Texas Forensic Science Commission. His findings were, in formal scientific language, devastating. The original investigators had relied on indicators that were not scientifically valid for the purpose for which they were used. The poor pattern interpretation did not meet the standards of contemporary fire investigation practice, and more significantly, Baylor noted that the research casting doubt on poor pattern analysis had been available before the original investigation was conducted. The crazed glass finding reflected a misunderstanding of glass fracture mechanics that had been corrected in the fire science literature years before the original investigation. The multiple origin conclusion was not supported by the evidence as documented. On the burn trail and related observations, Baylor's assessment was similar. Plausible alternative explanations existed that did not require arson, and the investigators had not applied the kind of systematic exclusion methodology that valid fire science required. Baylor's overall assessment was that the investigation had been conducted below the standard of care, and that its conclusions regarding arson were not scientifically supportable. He did not conclude that there had been no arson. That conclusion was not available to him. The physical evidence no longer existed in its original state, and no reconstruction of the scene was possible. What he concluded was that the methodology used to arrive at the arson finding was scientifically invalid. This is a specific and important distinction. The Willingham case cannot be resolved. It can only be examined, and what the examination shows is a chain of methodological failures that produced a conviction that should not have been possible under sound evidentiary practice. Baylor was scheduled to present his findings to the Commission in October of 2009. On the eve of that presentation, the chairman of the Texas Forensic Science Commission was replaced. Governor Perry appointed a new chairman, John Bradley, a district attorney from Williamson County with no forensic science background. Bradley moved to postpone Baylor's scheduled presentation. The commission's meeting was cancelled. The postponement generated significant press attention. This was 2009, 5 years after the execution, and the Willingham case had by then attracted national coverage. Baylor's report was eventually presented to the commission after a months-long delay. The commission ultimately concluded that it lacked jurisdiction to make a formal finding on the Willingham case because Willingham was deceased and the original conduct occurred before the commission's enabling legislation. No formal finding of misconduct was ever entered. Manuel Vasquez died in 2005, 1 year after the execution. He was never formally interviewed under oath about his methodology in the Willingham case in any proceeding that could produce a public record. His certification as a fire investigator was current and in good standing at the time of his death. No disciplinary action was ever initiated against him. He had trained other investigators. The indicators he relied on in the Willingham case, the pore patterns, the crazed glass, the multiple origin analysis, were the same indicators he had used in other cases, some of which also resulted in convictions. How many of those convictions rested on the same invalid methodology is not a question the public record can currently answer. The Willingham case attracted scrutiny. The others did not attract the same kind of scrutiny. The methodology traveled from case to case by the same mechanism it traveled into the Willingham case. Through training, through certification programs, through the unexamined professional consensus that what experienced practitioners observed and documented was reliable because experienced practitioners had been observing and documenting it for decades. Johnny Webb, the jailhouse informant, had his pending charges reduced following his testimony. Years later, in a letter to a journalist, he recanted his account of the confession. He said he had fabricated the story. He later partially retracted the recantation, saying he had been pressured into making it by people connected to Willingham's advocates. The record on Webb's testimony is, at this point, a documented tangle of contradictions that cannot be resolved by any process currently available. The recantation exists. The retraction of the recantation exists. Neither eliminates the other. Neither tells you what Webb heard, if anything, in that jail. Stacey Willingham, who divorced Cameron during his time on death row, a fact the prosecution had highlighted as evidence of his coldness, later said publicly that she believed he had not set the fire. She said she had been manipulated during the investigation and the trial. She said she had not been told at the time the full scope of what the investigators were concluding or why. Governor Perry, asked about the case after the Baylor report became public, said he had full confidence in the Texas criminal justice system and that the process had been followed correctly. He did not address the specific scientific findings in Baylor's report. He was elected to a third term as governor in 2010. He later ran for president. This is not primarily a story about Cameron Todd Willingham's guilt or innocence. That question cannot be definitively answered now, and this is one of the most important facts about this case. The mechanism that produced his execution also destroyed the evidentiary record that might have resolved it. The structure that burned on December 23, 1991, no longer exists. The physical evidence that was recovered has degraded or been disposed of. A post-execution reconstruction of the fire cannot produce a scientific certainty that would either confirm or refute the arson determination. The window for that kind of certainty closed when it closed. It closed before the correction arrived. What the record does show, with documentary precision, is the chain. The fire investigation relied on methodology that the fire science community had begun to revise before the investigation occurred. The revision was not uniformly adopted. Practitioners in the field were not required to be current on peer-reviewed fire science research. There was no standard that required investigators to cite the empirical basis for their diagnostic conclusions. There was no requirement that arson findings in capital cases be reviewed by a second independent investigator before being used as the basis for a death sentence. The defense attorney did not retain a fire science expert. This was not prohibited. It was not required either. The indigent defense funding available for capital cases in Texas in 1992 did not systematically include budget for independent scientific expert review. The attorney made a judgment. The system permitted that judgment. The appeals process evaluated constitutional questions. It did not have a mechanism for evaluating whether the original scientific testimony was methodologically sound. The courts that reviewed Willingham's case were not reviewing the fire science. They were reviewing the process that produced the conviction. The process was, by the legal standards applied to it, valid. The report commissioned in the final weeks before his execution identified the scientific problem clearly and concisely. It arrived when it arrived. The timeline was determined by when it was commissioned, which was determined by when resources became available, which was determined by the structure of indigent capital defense in a system where execution dates are set before review processes are complete. The report was stamped, "Received." 4 days later, the execution was carried out. There is a particular quality to a chain of this kind. Each individual link has an explanation. The investigator used the methodology he was trained in. The attorney worked within the resources available to him. The courts applied the standards they were legally required to apply. The board voted on the information before it. The governor's office received the report when it arrived. No single person in the chain made a decision that was formally prohibited. Every decision was within the range of decisions that the system permitted. The outcome, the execution of a man for a crime that the available evidence cannot confirm he committed, based on fire science that the available record indicates was invalid, was produced by the accumulation of permitted decisions, each one reasonable within its own frame, each one contributing a specific increment to a result that no individual actor fully controlled, and no individual actor was required to prevent. This is not a story about a monster. There is no monster. That is the point. Monsters are easy. Monsters get identified, removed, prosecuted. A chain does not get prosecuted. It gets filed. It gets reviewed. It gets a commission. The commission writes a report. The report notes the findings. The findings are not enacted. And somewhere, in some jurisdiction, the same chain is assembling the same links in the same order. The mechanism does not require extraordinary events to operate. It requires ordinary ones. An investigator trained on unvalidated methodology, an attorney with insufficient resources, a court reviewing process rather than fact, a board voting on a timeline, a report that arrived on the 13th. The gap was 4 days. The previous video in this series was about an engineer who discovered a catastrophic flaw in the most important thing he had ever built. He had 12 years of work, a career, a reputation, and a set of very clear incentives pointing towards silence. He picked up the phone. The building was fixed. Nobody died. The story stayed out of the press for 17 years and is still not widely known. That case is the exception. This case is the pattern. The next video covers 2 countries that made the same error. Not a similar error, the same error. Separated by 50 years and 5,000 miles. Neither country knew about the other's case when they made their decisions. The pattern did not require communication to reproduce itself. It only required the same system, the same methodology, the same moment when the correction arrived after the consequence. That is next.